The title of my address this morning is Leading Your Business into the Future, and certainly I wouldn't pretend to be knowledgeable on all of the different forms of business that are represented here this morning. But what I'm going to do is really to talk about the role and impact of technology in the future of business, the relationship between the CEO, CFO and CIO, aligning an organisation with an objective of customer satisfaction, and managing costs effectively. And finally, just touching on the intricacies of expanding into Australia. In covering these topics, I'm really drawing upon my experience of the last 20 years as a chief executive in 3 different companies and 2 different industries. And I would hasten to add, I don't have all the answers, but I have had some interesting learnings over that 20-year period. Turning to technology, and I'd just like to pick up on what Peter Edwin had to say on behalf of Oracle just a few minutes ago. A very important message that he gave was that if you're going to install a package, install the package. Don't try and customize it. I've seen many, many disasters over many, many years of organisations that have bought packages and then tried to customize them. They might get away with it for the first release, but subsequent releases become hell. And the problem is that, to a larger effect, the absence of bugs in the testing comes down to the quality of the testing, not the robustness of what you've actually added. You actually introduce a high degree of risk by making those changes. And certainly in my time, particularly over the last 15 years or so, I've made it almost a cardinal rule within the organisations that I've been in. When we buy packages, we implement the package as it was designed, not in the way that we would like to make it somewhat different. So looking at technology, particularly information technology, it's been the Achilles heel of many companies, particularly those in the banking industry. Think of recent situations. RBS in the UK in the middle of last year was out for several days, their retail banking systems. Systems that were poorly documented, systems that were old, and systems that needed significant upgrading. The Bank of America, earlier in the year, suffered a similar situation with its systems. We've also seen such implementations in Australia, a system called CS90 that Westpac tried to install back in the 1990s, which became a big black hole and in the end was written off in its entirety, and as an example of how to do things poorly, that was a great example. My own experience with, or not my own experience, but the Commonwealth Bank had an experience prior to my arrival where they attempted to move to a package, but made the cardinal sin of attempting to significantly customise it. That was a program called Mainstream in the mid-1990s, and after spending somewhere in the order of $300 million, was written off, and nothing was actually achieved or retained from that investment. So for big banks in particular, changing technology has always been challenging and has always come at high risk. And that's probably one of the reasons that large banks still have large legacy systems that go back 30, 40 years in some cases. They're batch-oriented, they're account-based rather than customer-based, and when you look at them, they were actually designed for a different time in banking. They were designed around checks, large micro-reader systems. They were banks, when these systems were designed, opened at 10 o'clock in the morning, closed at 3 in the afternoon. And there was an old cheeky adage or phrase about banking that it was around a formula called 363. Borrow money off your depositors at 3%, lend it out at 6%, and be on the golf course by 3 in the afternoon. Banking has changed significantly since those days. But what that's meant is that in many situations, banks have spent a lot of money on patching and grafting their systems. They have endeavoured to take those legacy-based systems that were designed for check processing and turn them into quasi-real-time systems, quasi-customer-oriented systems, systems that can provide access 24/7, but with a high degree of complexity and cost going on in the background to make these systems do things that they were never originally designed to do. And that has resulted in significant reliability problems that, because of the complexity that is ingrained in those systems and the various different linkages, that they are prone to reliability problems. At ASB, we had a system that looked just like that. Fortunately, we decided in the mid-70s to replace it. 30 years later, when I became CEO at CBA in 2005, guess what CBA was still running? A variant of that same software that we'd replaced at ASB in the mid to late 70s. The replacement system was real-time and customer-oriented rather than account-based, meaning that we could quickly establish the customer's total banking relationship, significantly reduced the cost of processing, and did away with most of the back office functions. Created a basis for agility and innovation, which led to ASB being the first bank in New Zealand to introduce ATMs, FPOS, internet banking, and online share broking. This flexible IT infrastructure allowed the bank to evolve from a savings bank to a full-service bank, allowing the bank to provide business, rural, and corporate banking services in addition to the retail banking services that it had in place for over 100 years, and at the same time embark upon a national branch expansion program. So this is back in 1990. At that time, the ASB was 1/6 the size of the then largest bank in New Zealand. 15 years later, it had grown to equal the size of that bank through pure organic growth. And I believe the reasons behind that success were a strong company culture, a genuine customer focus, superior information technology, supported by disciplined execution of a structured sales and service program. What happened at ASB was an organisation that during the 1980s had somewhat lost its way. It was a period of major change in New Zealand, as you would all remember, with Rogernomics. And as part of that change was a restructuring of what were called the trustee savings banks. The trustee savings banks had been 100% government guaranteed on the basis that about 60% of their deposits were held in government stock, and the offset for that was obviously the government guarantee. But Roger Douglas and the Labor government came to the conclusion that the banking industry had to be deregulated and that a bank, to be a bank, had to satisfy capital requirements, it had to satisfy a range of requirements in order to continue to operate as a bank. That meant that the trustee savings banks had to change quickly. They had to become better capitalised, they had to become more focused on the business of banking, and had to develop a lot of expertise fairly quickly. I think it's a credit to the trustee savings bank system that those banks were able to make the move in a very difficult environment for them from what had been largely a protected niche in the market to become fully competitive without seeing one of those banks fail, which was not the case in Australia, where you saw banks like the State Bank of South Australia, the State Bank of Victoria, all who had to confront the same sorts of issues in and around morphing from being a protected species to becoming part of the mainstream banking environment. Those two banks in particular failed, and the other savings banks or state-based savings banks also had major difficulties through that period in Australia. So New Zealand was, I think, significantly protected from the problems that happened in Australia, which led to a lot of taxpayer funds being used to support those banks, particularly at the state level. Rolling forward to 2005, when I arrived at CBA, I was confronted with an organisation that had a poor company culture. The bank had been successfully privatised in the early 90s from being a government instrumentality and had done a good job in actually going through that process. But it still had very much a public service ethos in the organisation. The media in Australia would refer to the Commonwealth Bank culture as the brown cardigan culture, and certainly when you walked through the organisation, you very quickly saw that it was an organisation that was very union-based, union-oriented, and had by far and away the largest penetration of the financial services union in the banking industry in Australia. And that wasn't surprising, given the fact that there was such a degree of mistrust between staff and management. And it was particularly interesting when I attended my first annual general meeting that not only was I confronted by shareholders who were unhappy with many elements of the performance of the bank, but also with members of the union and members of our staff who, as shareholders, had come to the annual general meeting and used that as a platform to air their grievances. I'm pleased to say that that was the last meeting that I had to experience that situation. Subsequently, the environment had improved so dramatically that the union and staff saw no reason to use the bank's annual general meeting as a platform for airing their grievances. So along with that cultural problem, the organisation was beginning to experience falling market shares in most of its product categories. It had by far and away the poorest customer satisfaction of the Big Four. And even so, it still was the second largest bank by market cap in Australia and the fifth largest company by market cap in Australia and the 45th largest financial institution by market cap in the world. Unfortunately, it also had the lowest number of products per customer of its competitors. It had unreliable technology, and I touched on that by talking about the fact that banks, in many respects, didn't want to take the risk of going through major systems upgrades because of the problems that had been experienced by many banks in trying to do that, and had decided to go down the path of patch and graft. And as a result of that, we would have something in the order of 70 odd what we called severity 1 failures annually. And so you're talking around 5 or 6 a month, 1 a week, and we're talking about outages that had a significant impact on the customer base and would end up with significant queues and branches as transactions would not be processed and could not be captured at the branch. And it meant that staff worked a lot of overtime having to backload transactions when systems came back and were available again. So to address these problems, we launched a new strategy based on 5 imperatives. Not surprisingly, customer service. Business banking. And why particularly business banking? Well, during the mid-1990s, the Commonwealth Bank had had 23% share of the business banking market. By 2005, that had fallen to 13% and was still in decline. Operational excellence. We certainly had to improve our game, lift our game. We couldn't continue to do things like when customers wanted to withdraw funds from another branch, a branch that wasn't their home branch, they had to wait while somebody rang their home branch and got a signature card faxed to the branch in order for their signature to be checked. That certainly in itself created huge numbers of queues, particularly in metropolitan Sydney. Trust and team spirit. And you say that's a rather soft sort of strategy. Well, in my view, if an organisation doesn't have a great working relationship, a great sense of camaraderie, then the organisation is not going to be successful in the long run. and certainly profitable growth. We had been an organisation that had launched and picked up new ideas, but often these new ideas came at a cost and didn't deliver to the bottom line. And what you generally find is that people that have responsibilities for these areas of operation usually are supreme optimists. It's going to be better next year. And you keep pouring money down the same hole, and the hole just gets deeper. There's a requirement to overhaul senior management. A new CFO, a new CIO, new heads of the business bank, the retail bank, the corporate and institutional bank, and wealth management, and a new head of HR. We introduced ASB's sales and service program into Commonwealth Bank. Commonwealth Bank had attempted to install that program and run that program twice before, once in the late 1990s and again in the early 2000s, and both times the implementations had failed. They had not gained traction. Probably not surprising when you looked at the fact that there was such an issue around staff morale and staff support for management, and the staff's feeling that the organisation was on the right track. Also, we needed to make sure that as an organisation we had strong communication. I embarked upon a program of making sure that every staff member every week received an email from me identifying what I was doing, what the organisation was doing, and also highlighting the people in our organisation who were being successful, who were having customer commendations made about them and major account wins in the business banking area. And very much a focus on customers, and also putting in place the right measurement and rewards process. And certainly from my view, it's the old story, as we all know, what gets measured gets done. If the boss is interested, then people in the organisation are going to take an interest. And therefore it comes down to the fact that the boss has to show passion, has to show leadership, and has to indicate that there is a better future for the organisation and continue to beat the drum and tell the stories. Productivity and simplification were critical for us as an organisation. We as an organisation were large by Australian standards, with over 40,000 staff based in Australia and some 12,000 staff offshore in 13 different countries. And at the same time, in those range of businesses, they tended to and had operated like silos. So we had banks within banks, we had processes duplicated, triplicated, quadruplicated through the organisation, which meant that we had a great opportunity for improving productivity, simplifying processes, and making sure that we put in place a very well-structured shared services facility. Also, it was very important to understand what our customers thought. And so letters of commendation and complaints, I made sure that any of those that came to me, were addressed to me, were responded to by me. And in many instances, I would phone the customer, particularly around complaints, to talk to them about the issue. As a result of that, I would deal with the 10 best commendations and the 10 worst complaints on a weekly basis by ringing the staff that were involved. Obviously, the commendation calls were very, very easy to ring and say it was the chief executive. Initially, staff members were taken by surprise and didn't believe it was actually the chief executive on the phone. The complaints were a little different. And the complaints weren't about kicking somebody in the backside. The complaints were about making sure I could understand how we as an organisation had let our staff member down. How come this complaint had happened? What were the reasons? What could we do to make sure that it didn't happen again? Immediately after that phone call, I would call the manager of that person and very quickly establish the fact that what we needed to do in order to make sure that it didn't happen again. So, given the fact that this is a very short presentation from the point of view of 35 minutes, and I can't go into any great detail, I'll very quickly skip to where CBA is today. In regard to its culture, it is now rated as world-class by the Gallup organisation, whereas on the Gallup organisation we had been very much an underperformer back in 2005. Since 2005, CBA has increased its market share in almost every product category. Its customer satisfaction has gone from being the worst to the best of the Big Four in every sector: retail, business, corporate, private banking and wealth management. It's gone from being the second largest bank by market cap in Australia to now the largest bank in Australia by market cap. It's gone from being the fifth largest company by market cap in Australia to the second largest company by market cap in Australia. Gone from being the 45th largest financial institution in the world to the 8th largest financial institution by market cap in the world. And I have to make a statement here and a clarification that obviously in that period we've had the global financial crisis. And many of you will remember, well, I hope, some of you won't, a fellow called Stephen Bradbury. Stephen Bradbury was an ice skater who ice skated for Australia and was in the Olympics back in the early part of the 2000s. And in his race, he entered the last lap in 6th position, and the 5 skaters in front of him collided with one another, hit the floor, and he went from 6th to gold medal. And to some extent, our move from 45th to 8th characterises some of that when you think of the large financial institutions that have really made a mess of themselves through the global financial crisis. Gone from the lowest number of products per customer to now the highest number of products per customer. Severity 1 failures have reduced from over 70 to now 4 per annum. And that has been brought about by a significant overhaul of the IT systems within the Commonwealth Bank Group. And in overhauling those systems, we very much went down the path of packages, we very much went down the path of non-modification, and also made sure that all of the business units that were involved in those systems, we made sure that they put their very best people on those projects. Too often you see organisations push people that, oh, well, they're not so good at the front line, or they're not so good at generating business, we will move them into IT. And that, I think, has led to, particularly from the point of view of testing, from the point of view of implementation, from the business's perspective. I'm not talking about the IT professionals, I'm talking about the people that actually interact and give the information of how we want to use the system within the business. So you've got to make sure that you've got very good business people playing their part in making sure those systems are actually going to work and are going to provide the organisation with what it needs. So CBA's technology overhaul has seen its systems now based around 21st century systems, structured similarly to many of the social media type systems, the way that a Google operates, or a Facebook, or an Amazon. And certainly that is something that is going to be a significant challenge for banks in the future. If they don't migrate their IT platforms to contemporary platforms, their ability to manage the customer relationship, to understand the customer, to be able to innovate is going to be severely impacted, and their competition won't necessarily come from amongst themselves, but from organisations that are able to take their strengths in understanding customers, understanding processes, understanding technology, and being able to apply that to the business of banking. To make the changes, or to achieve the achievements that have been achieved in CBA over the last several years, there's had to be a high degree of organisational commitment. It's about making sure that the right people are in the right place, doing the right job, and that they lead and role model from the front of the organisation. And certainly, from my perspective, these results were achieved through a very strong organisational alignment, shared objectives and rewards. And I think it's very important not to underestimate the power of success or power of improvement to create alignment and cooperation. At the same time, it's important to keep everybody's feet firmly on the ground and a guard against hubris. Moving to the CFO and relationships with CIOs. With all my relationships with my senior team, while all my relationships with my senior team were important, none was more so than that with my CFOs. At ASB it was John Duncan. At Air New Zealand, Rob McDonald, who many of you will know. Rob is an outstanding CFO, and I think that the work that has been done at Air New Zealand around its financial operations, around its leasing contracts, its hedging, etc., has a lot to do with the skill of Rob McDonald. Given the limited amount of time this morning, I haven't touched on Air New Zealand, which could easily consume all the time of this session, mainly because the story is well known to many of you, and the ingredients I touch on today are similar to Air New Zealand, or are as similar to Air New Zealand as they are to ASB and CBA. At CBA, my CFO was a fellow called David Craig. David was a former PwC partner who played a major role in the divestment of PwC Consulting to IBM. And David was very much a CFO's CFO, all over the detail, an excellent manager and leader. He attracts and retains great talent, always focused on improving his team's capabilities, always prepared to speak his mind, which I think is a very important attribute. If anyone is in a position to push back on the CEO, it should be the CFO. Many CEOs have failed through not heeding the advice of their CFO. The CFO cannot just be a good numbers person, they need to be multidimensional. They must be a leader, a strategist, and have a good understanding of the way the business operates. The CFO is the navigator, in airline parlance, to the pilot, the CEO. That's probably a poor analogy, given that navigators are now redundant on the flight deck, while CFOs will never be. In regard to the role of CIO, I've always been a believer that the person filling this role should report directly to the CEO. Maybe I'm biased, but given the stakes these days in IT, the operational and strategic leverage that can be gained, it makes sense to have a very big person in this role. Today, this person is not just a techie, but a strategist, a leader, an innovator, and critically, a good people manager. And I was very fortunate to have a fellow called Michael Hart as my CIO at Commonwealth Bank. Customer service, organisational alignment, a structured process around customers and disciplined execution are, in my view, fundamental requirements for achieving high levels of customer satisfaction. I don't know of any organisation that has been successful in customer engagement without first being successful in staff engagement at all levels. Too many companies pay lip service to customer service and think clever advertising campaigns or paying to buy customers through acquisitions is more cost effective than investing and doing the hard work to become a high customer satisfaction company. And it's hard work, getting company alignment, commitment, the learnings ingrained, consistency across channels and outlets. However, as I said earlier, the boss has to be passionate and the role model for driving the process and to keep beating the drum. It's also important that companies are cognizant of new business models that may end up eating their lunch. There have been many companies who have failed by not evolving and adapting. Some examples are the mini computer makers, DEC, Prime, Wang, who were killed by Intel and Microsoft, who were responsible for the PC. Kodak's another example, voted the US most admired company in the late 1990s, a little over 10 years later in Chapter 11, killed by the digital camera. Ironically, a technology Kodak itself invented in 1975, but who were slow to develop it because they didn't want to cannibalise the film business that they dominated. failure to adapt quickly enough brought about their demise. Quickly on costs, any first cut of an annual budget that I've seen is generally optimistic on revenue and pessimistic on costs. My focus has always been on achieving positive jaws, that is, the percentage revenue growth exceeds the percentage cost growth, through looking to achieve productivity benefits and scale benefits. But I think it's very important to realise that there are such things as good costs. We must invest in the future of our companies. We must make sure that we have got the capability to continue on into the future, because too often we see companies that end up being underinvested in their futures, ending up paying the price. Quickly touching on Australia and launching into Australia, because I have effectively run out of time. If you're going into Australia, do your homework. Australia is not one contiguous market. It's made up of 6 states, 2 territories, each with their own regulations and costs by way of different levies and payroll taxes. The states tend to compete with each other in providing handouts to capture jobs and income from new entrant companies, and over recent years there's also become quite a nationalistic bent towards favouring Australian companies. While it is a bigger market, there are also bigger and well-resourced companies to contend with, who won't cede market share easily and don't underestimate the value and strength of political relationships at both the state and federal levels. In conclusion, focusing on the future is the place where we're all going to live and work. To be successful, we need to plan and shape our futures and not just be content to react to it, because that in itself is a recipe for failure. I wish you all the best for the rest of the summit. Thank you.